I'm going to tell you something I've never told in the right order. I've said pieces of it. To my sister, to a therapist I stopped seeing because she kept asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. To my daughter once, badly, in a way I had to go back and fix. But I've never started at the beginning and followed it all the way through to the part I didn't want to know. The part that changed everything. The part that showed me who I actually was, as opposed to who I'd been telling myself I was for 7 years. By the time I finish, you might think less of me. That's okay. I think less of me too. A little. Not in a way that destroys me anymore, but in a way that's honest. And honest is what I owe this story. Here's what you need to know. Before I say anything else, there's a man who spent years not knowing he had a daughter. There's a little girl who grew up without a father, not because he didn't want to be there, but because I decided, on his behalf, that he wouldn't. And there's me, cleaning his office for 7 years, close enough to hear him on the phone, close enough to know what kind of week he was having, and never once telling him the truth. I've made that sound reasonable before, practical, even protective. I'm not doing that today. I've never told this out loud, start to finish. If you're willing to stay with me through all of it, hit subscribe. I need someone to witness this. I was 23 when I took the job, and I want to be clear about something. I was not someone things just happened to. I was organized. I was paying attention. I had been 2 credits away from finishing a business degree when my mother got sick. Not the fast kind, not the kind that has a clear ending and a recovery you can plan around, but the slow and expensive kind that rearranges your entire life without asking permission. So I made a decision. I took a job with a commercial cleaning company because it paid on time. The hours were early enough that I could still be home by noon, and it required nothing from me except the work itself. No meetings, no performance reviews, no one pulling me aside to ask how I was holding up. I showed up. I did the work. I left. That was the whole transaction. I want to make that sound like survival. And it was. I was keeping myself afloat during one of the hardest stretches of my life, and the stability of that job was real. But here's what I don't want to skip over, because it matters later. I also liked it for a reason I wasn't fully honest about at the time. Nobody asked me anything, not about my mother, not about the degree I'd put on hold, not about where I thought I was going or what I thought I was building. I walked into those buildings before the city was awake, and I existed in a kind of useful silence that I had mistaken for peace. At 23, with everything feeling like too much, I called that peace. I called it exactly what I needed. What it actually was, and I can only see this now from the other side of it, was practice. I was learning how to be present in a space without being known in it. I was learning how to move through someone else's world without leaving a trace of myself behind. I didn't know yet that I was going to take that habit with me everywhere. I didn't know yet how much it was going to cost. The firm on the 9th floor was mid-sized, quiet in the way that money tends to make things quiet. Good carpet, real plants, the kind of coffee machine that someone was always leaving dirty. I worked 4 floors in that building, and the 9th was the one that felt most like a world I was adjacent to but not part of. I noticed that early. I filed it away. I don't remember the exact morning I first spoke to Remy. What I remember is that it was winter, still dark outside, and I was in the small break room near the copy room when he walked in still wearing his coat, like he'd come straight from outside and hadn't decided yet whether he was staying. Most people startled when they found me there. There's something unsettling about encountering a stranger in a space you think of as yours. He didn't startle. He looked at me for a moment, easy and unhurried, and then he said, "Do you want a cup? I make it strong." Just like that, as if we'd already been introduced. I said yes, and that was the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, before the building filled, he'd arrive early, and I'd still be on the 9th floor, and somewhere between the copy room and the windows overlooking the street, we started talking. Really talking, the kind where time moves differently. He remembered things I mentioned offhandedly. The name of the rehab facility my mother had moved to, the fact that I'd been studying accounting before everything changed, a book I'd mentioned once, in passing, that I'd been trying to finish for 3 months. He listened the way some people read, carefully, like he intended to go back and find the parts that mattered. And I noticed other things, the quality of his watch, the ease with which he moved through that space, not arrogance, something quieter than that, a kind of belonging that you either grew up with or you didn't. I felt the gap between where he was going and where I was standing, and I told myself I was being clear-eyed about it. Mature, realistic. I want to stop here and be honest, because I've let myself off the hook on this point for too long. I wasn't being mature. I was building an exit before I decided to walk through the door. I was measuring the distance between our worlds and writing it into the story before the story had even started, so that if it ended badly, I could say I'd seen it coming, so that the loss, if it came, would feel like confirmation instead of surprise. I called it being realistic. Now I think I was writing the ending before I'd read the story. I want to tell you what those months were actually like, because I think it matters. I think you need to feel what I had before I show you what I did with it. He took me to dinner at a restaurant I couldn't have afforded on my own. Not the kind of place that makes a show of being expensive, just the kind where everything is quietly right, where the lighting is low and the service is unhurried, and you realize halfway through the meal that you haven't checked the time once. I remember sitting across from him and thinking, I am not supposed to be comfortable here, and then realizing that he had somehow made the room feel like it had always had a seat for me, even when I knew, logically, that wasn't true. We argued about optimism once, whether it was something you were born with or something you chose strategically, and the argument went in circles for the better part of an hour before we both started laughing because we'd realized we were making the same point from different directions. That happened more than once. We'd be halfway through a disagreement, and one of us would catch it first, and the whole thing would just dissolve. There was a night I fell asleep on his couch, reading something for a class I'd gone back to, part-time, slowly. I woke up with a blanket on me that hadn't been there before. He was still at his desk across the room. He looked up when he heard me stir and said quietly, "Go back to sleep." Not like a dismissal, like a permission, like someone who understood that rest was something I didn't give myself easily, and who wanted to protect it. I didn't say I loved him out loud, not once, in all of it. I've thought about that more than almost anything else. At the time, I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, waiting until it felt safe enough to say the real thing. But I've had a long time to sit with that explanation, and I'm not sure it's true. I think there's another possibility I've been avoiding. I don't know if I was waiting for safety, or building a reason to say it never counted, because if I never said it out loud, then maybe I never fully committed. And if I never fully committed, then maybe what came next was something I could walk away from. I didn't walk away cleanly, but I walked away. I found out on a Tuesday morning, not one of the Tuesday mornings I'd been to the 9th floor, a different Tuesday, alone in my apartment, sitting on the edge of the bathtub with the kind of stillness that happens when your body already knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I sat with that information for 2 weeks before I said a word to anyone. Now here's where I have to be careful, because this is the part I've softened the most over the years. When I've told pieces of this story before, I've described those 2 weeks as agonizing, full of conflict, a woman paralyzed by fear and circumstance, trying to figure out the right thing to do. And there was fear in it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Real fear. The kind that lives in your chest and changes the quality of your breathing. But that's not the whole truth. And I promised you the whole truth. The whole truth is that I didn't agonize. I stalled. And while I stalled, I started doing something else entirely. I started watching him. When he asked what was wrong, and he did ask more than once with the same quiet attention he'd always given me, I told him I was tired, that things with my mother were harder than usual, that I needed a little space. The last part was true. The rest of it was a way of buying time for a decision I was telling myself I hadn't made yet, but I had made it. I just hadn't admitted it to myself. I want to tell you, I was scared. That's true, but fear doesn't explain 2 weeks of watching someone and looking for a reason to disappear. Fear is a response. What I was doing was a search. I was moving through those 2 weeks with my eyes open and my conclusion already written, looking for the evidence that would make it feel like logic instead of cowardice. I watched him at a work event I wasn't supposed to know about, laughing easily with people who came from where he came from, who carried themselves the same way he did, who fit inside that world without having to think about it. I listened to pieces of a phone call with his mother and heard the outline of a life I had never been properly introduced to. I watched a woman named Calla drop off his lunch one afternoon. A friend, he'd said, someone from before, and I noted how long she stayed, how naturally she moved through the space around him, how little she seemed to question whether she belonged there. And I filed it all away, not as information, as confirmation. I had already decided. I was just building the case that would let me live with it. Have you ever done that? Watch someone closely, not to understand them, but to confirm what you'd already decided. I'd genuinely like to know. Drop it in the comments. I don't think I'm the only one who's done this. By the end of those 2 weeks, I had what I needed. That's how I thought about it. What I needed, not the truth, not clarity. What I needed to do, what I'd already decided to do. I looked at everything I'd collected, and I called it a diagnosis. The distance I'd felt from the beginning, the one I'd been telling myself I was mature enough to see clearly. I reframed it now as a wall, permanent and structural, the kind that doesn't come down just because 2 people want it to. I told myself I was being honest about the shape of things. I told myself I was sparing both of us from something that was never going to work the way I needed it to. What I was actually doing was converting fear into certainty, so I didn't have to sit with the fear anymore. I stopped returning his calls. When he came in early, and I was already on the 9th floor, I made sure I was finished before he arrived. I requested a floor reassignment from my supervisor, said I needed a change of routine, which wasn't entirely untrue, and I moved to the 12th and 14th floors. I left the 9th floor behind me and told myself that was the hard part done. A month later, through the quiet channels that exist in every office building, the overheard conversations, the shifted energy, the way people's names start appearing together, found out that Remy and Kala had started seeing each other, and I held that piece of information up like it was a verdict. See, I told myself, he moved on fast. That tells you everything you needed to know. You made the right call. You were right about the wall. I carried that for years. The speed of it, the ease of it, or what looked like ease from the distance I'd put between us. I used it as the foundation of the whole story I built. Because if he moved towards someone else that quickly, then what we'd had was exactly as fragile as I'd suspected, and my silence had been wisdom, not damage. I want to stop here and say something clearly before we go any further. He moved toward Kala because I had disappeared without explanation. He had no idea why. He hadn't been given a choice. I had removed the choice before he knew there was one to make, and then I held the outcome against him. Opal was born in November. 7 pounds, small, serious face, the kind of newborn who looks like they arrived already thinking about something important. I held her in that hospital room and felt 2 things at the exact same time, so completely that I couldn't separate them. The most total love I had ever experienced in my life, the kind that reorganizes you permanently, that makes every version of yourself that existed before it feel like a rough draft, and a grief so specific and so private that I couldn't hand it to anyone, couldn't name it out loud, could only carry it quietly alongside everything else. I went back to work 8 weeks later. The company had restructured while I was out, and the 9th floor was available again. My supervisor mentioned it without pressure. Just an option, familiar territory, if I wanted it. And I said yes. I want to be careful here, because I've told this part the easy way too many times. I've said I needed the money, and that was true. I did, genuinely, in the concrete and pressing way that single mothers need money. But that's not the whole reason I took that floor back, and I think you already know that. I wasn't ready to make him a stranger. That's the truth I've been stepping around. I had made a unilateral decision about his life and my daughter's life, and somewhere underneath the certainty I'd constructed, there was something I hadn't fully buried, some part of me that wasn't done, that needed to stay close, even at the cost of staying invisible. So I went back. He was at his desk some mornings, and not others. I learned the rhythm of his week the way you learn the habits of a place you've spent a long time in. Not consciously, just through accumulation. I watched him get better at his work. The documents on his desk grew more complex. The names on the business cards changed in ways that told a story of momentum. He married Kala 2 years after I returned. She put a framed photo on his credenza, the 2 of them at what looked like a coastal dinner, easy and laughing, and I cleaned around it every week without letting myself look at it directly. I told myself I had made peace, that the life I was building for Opal and myself was enough, and more than enough, and that what I'd chosen had been the right shape for all of us, even if it hadn't felt that way at the beginning. I told myself that for 7 years, I got very good at it. If you know someone who's carrying a silence like this, something that's gone on long enough that it's started to feel permanent, share this with them. Not to call them out, not to make them feel worse than they already do, just so they know that someone else has been here and found a way through. Go ahead and share this. It might be exactly what they need to hear right now. I finished my degree in March, part-time, across far too many years, in the stolen hours between early mornings and school pickups, and everything else that makes up a life when you're building it mostly alone. An accounting firm had offered me a position, real hours, real pay, the kind of professional footing that would change the trajectory of things for Opal and me in ways I'd been working toward for a long time. My last day with the cleaning company, my supervisor let me do a final round of my usual floors, a kind of farewell. I think she meant it warmly. I accepted it without examining too closely what I was actually saying goodbye to. I moved through the 12th floor, then the 14th, routine, methodical, the work I'd done so many times that my hands knew it without instruction. Then I took the elevator down to 9. I told myself it was just the familiar order of things, that there was no particular reason I'd saved it for last. I was in Remy's office longer than I needed to be. I straightened the stack of folders on the corner of his desk. They didn't need straightening. I repositioned the pen cup an inch to the left and then moved it back. I stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the street below, the way I'd watched him do 100 times, and I tried to understand what I was doing there, what I thought I was closing. When I picked up my bucket near the side of his desk, I felt something shift in my apron pocket. Opal's school picture, the one that had come in the week before, the one I'd been carrying, the way parents carry those photos everywhere before they find a permanent place for them, had slipped out. It landed on the floor beside his desk without a sound. I didn't notice. I finished the room, turned off the light, and left. He found it that evening. I was in the parking lot, keys in hand, already thinking about what Opal and I were going to do that weekend to mark the occasion. Something small, something that would mean more to me than to her, when I heard the building door open behind me. I heard my name. He said it quietly, the same way he used to say it in the break room before the building filled, before the day had started, back when it was just the two of us and bad coffee and all that unhurried time. I turned around. He was standing in the cold, holding the photograph. What he said next is the thing I've been building toward this entire time, and it's the thing that undid 7 years in about 30 seconds. Stay with me. He didn't ask if she was his. I had prepared for that question, somewhere in the back of my mind, the way you prepare for things you hope won't happen, but know you have no right to avoid. I had thought about what I would say, how I would say it, whether I would be able to hold myself together in the saying of it. I had a version ready. I had been carrying a version ready for 7 years. He didn't ask. He looked at me at the photograph, then back at me, and what he said was this: I looked for you, for a long time after you disappeared. I thought I'd done something. Quietly, without accusation, the way you say something that has gone smooth from being carried too long, something you stopped expecting to say out loud but never quite let go of either. I stood there in the cold and felt the ground shift under the story I had been living inside. He had looked for me, not moved on cleanly, not confirmed the wall I'd built in my mind, looked for me. He had spent time in the aftermath of my silence trying to understand what he'd done wrong, what he'd missed, where the thing between us had broken without his noticing. He had not been given the chance to make a decision. I had made the decision, closed the door from the inside, and then watched him eventually move toward the only thing available to him, someone who hadn't disappeared, and called it proof of everything I'd already believed. The speed of it, the ease of it, the thing I'd held up as a verdict for 7 years. It wasn't a verdict. It was a consequence, my consequence, one I had authored and then handed to him to carry without ever telling him what it was. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I'm not sure I was capable of it. There is a particular kind of reckoning that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with force or noise. It just moves through you quietly and leaves everything rearranged. That's what happened in that parking lot. Standing in the cold, looking at the man I had spent 7 years carefully not knowing, I felt the architecture of my own story begin to come apart. Not his story. Mine. The one I had built to survive something I had never been brave enough to risk. The one that had never been true. We talked for a long time in that parking lot. Long enough that the cold stopped feeling like something to manage and became just the condition we were in. He asked questions I answered honestly, maybe for the first time in 7 years. I told him about Opal, about November, about the serious little face that had looked from the very first day like she already had opinions about things. I watched him receive that information, and I didn't look away from what it did to him, because I felt I owed him at least that, the dignity of being witnessed in the moment his world changed shape. And then I drove home, and I sat alone for a long time, and I made myself answer the question I'd been avoiding since the moment I heard him say, I thought I'd done something. Who was I actually protecting? I had told myself Opal. I had built an entire internal monument to that answer. The practicality of it, the selflessness of it, the clear-eyed maternal logic of a woman who understood the shape of the world and made hard decisions accordingly. I had lived inside that answer for so long that it had started to feel like character, like something admirable. Even, it wasn't Opal, it was me. What I had been protecting, from the very beginning, was the version of myself that could not survive being rejected at the most vulnerable I had ever been. I was pregnant, alone, with a mother in a facility and a degree on hold and a life that felt held together mostly by routine and discipline. And the thing I could not face, the thing that had no room in the story I was telling, was the possibility that I could hand Remy the truth, the whole of it, the most exposed and undefended version of myself, and watch him choose differently anyway. Choose his world. Choose the ease of a life that already made sense. Choose anything other than me. I couldn't survive that possibility, so I made it impossible. I removed the choice before it could be made, and I called it practicality. I called it protecting my daughter. I called it being realistic about walls and distances and the way the world actually works. I gave the fear so many respectable names that I eventually stopped being able to see it for what it was, but I had always known, not as a clear thought, not as something I could have said out loud, but as a small and persistent ache I had learned to breathe around, the kind of knowing that lives below the level of argument, that no amount of careful reasoning ever fully quiets. I wasn't wise. I was afraid. And I had dressed the fear up so thoroughly, for so long, that it had started to look like strength. Here is the thing about a silence that goes on long enough. It doesn't stay inside you. It travels. It finds the people closest to you, and teaches them things you never meant to teach. Opal grew up watching me keep careful distances, not coldly. I want to be clear about that. I loved her loudly and consistently, and with everything I had, but she also watched me manage closeness. Watched me let people near enough to matter, but not near enough to change things. Watched me treat vulnerability like a liability, something to be budgeted carefully rather than offered freely. She was a perceptive child, that serious face from the very first day, and perceptive children learn the lessons underneath the lessons. They learn what you do, not what you say. I didn't teach her that love was safe. I taught her that love was something you handled from a careful distance, and that the distance was wisdom, and that wisdom was the same thing as strength. She was learning it from me, and I had learned it from fear and dressed it up as something else and passed it on without meaning to. That is the part I have had to sit with the longest, not the years of silence, not the parking lot, not the conversation, not even the look on Remy's face when I told him about November. The part I carry is what my daughter absorbed from the shape of my choices before she was old enough to question them. I can't undo that. What I can do is be different now, deliberately, in ways she's old enough to notice. I cleaned his office for 7 years. I knew the weight of his trash, the color of his files, the way the afternoon light moved across his desk in winter. I knew everything about him and gave him nothing of myself. And on the last day, a photograph fell out of my pocket. He found it, and the whole careful architecture of my silence came down all at once. Love you abandoned before it can abandon you is not self-protection. It is just a different kind of loss, one you build yourself, stone by stone, and live inside alone. If something in this story sat with you, if you recognized something in Nessa that you weren't quite ready to name, I'd be honored to have you subscribe. Her story is one of many, and some of them might be yours.